When they heard this, they were furious and wanted to put them to death. The problem is, with that verse we just read, is that these religious leaders, the judges, do not have the authority to execute the death penalty, even though they wanted to put them to death, according to verse 33. They can't do so because they're under Roman rule. And Rome took away their ability to execute execution. And previously, we read that the apostles were in such high regard that by the townspeople that the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, they were even afraid to arrest them by force. They thought to themselves, if we arrest these apostles and bring them by force to trial or bring them by force back to prison, then the people will have an uprising because they have such high regard for the apostles, and they might even stone us, the judges, to death. We also know that many of the Sanhedrin, actually the majority of them, are Sadducees. Sadducees, if you remember, they are sellouts to Rome in exchange for positions of power, high society, and wealth. So the question is, what infuriated the judges, the Sanhedrin, so much to the point where they were willing to risk it all? They were willing to risk their comfortable life. They were willing to put to death the apostles, risking Rome coming in, taking away their possessions and positions of power. What infuriated them so much? And this is last week. So if you weren't here last week, it's the apostles' speech. And secondly, their lifestyle was already at risk anyway, so they're just like, well, let's just kill them. At least that's what they wanted to do. Now, if you remember from last week's sermon entitled Jealous Judges, the Sanhedrin claimed the apostles were trying to make them guilty of murdering Jesus Christ, the Messiah. They didn't believe he was the Messiah, but they said, by your speech in the courtroom, apostles, you're trying to make us guilty of killing Jesus, which is exactly what happened. We know, because we're Christians and we see history, 2020 is hindsight. Secondly, the apostles were gaining more and more influence from the people and ultimately taking the religious authority away from the Jewish religious leaders, and they were taking it from them. And so these two reasons very much infuriated the Supreme Court of the Jewish Supreme Court here. The bottom line is, and what Luke's trying to get across to us is, look, this murderous intent, it's for real. They are really thinking we need to kill these guys. It's not just a throwaway statement. This is for real, because for the Sanhedrin members, like, everything's at stake here, and they don't like that this is going to continue to grow in their opinion. So we just need to kill them. So then the second point is pump the brakes. Hold on. Whoa. This comes from verse 34. But a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, who was honored by all the people, stood up in the Sanhedrin and ordered that the men, the apostles, be put outside for a little while. Then he addressed the Sanhedrin, men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Now, the Pharisees only make up a pretty small percentage of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court. But the Pharisees had greater influence in society with, like, the common folk. They had more in common with the commoner. And so even though the Pharisees only make up a small percentage of the Sanhedrin, they had a lot of social status there, social sway. The Sadducees, and here's some of the things they had in common. The Sadducees, they did not believe in any resurrection, right? Once you die, you die. That's it. The Pharisees, they believed in a resurrection like most commoners, the common Jews. The Pharisees were looking for a personal Messiah. Of course, they reject Jesus as the personal Messiah, but they're looking for a personal Messiah, something that, again, is relatable to the common Jewish person at that time. The Pharisees believed in angels and demons. The Sadducees do not. The Pharisees lived a simple life because they thought that was the key to inviting God's presence into their life. And the Pharisees believed the more righteous we are, the more holy we can live by our behavior, the more we invite God to be with us. That's why they became legalistic. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, that sounds pretty good, actually, right? Isn't that true? The more holy I am, the more God will be with me. No, that skips the part of grace. That's skipping the part where you need Jesus' righteousness in grace put on us, then invite God's presence will be invited upon our lives. Now, this Gamaliel fellow that we talked about, he was the leader of one of the more influential groups, factions of Pharisees, okay? So Pharisees are not all the same. Even among the Pharisees, there were different schools, different groups. And this Gamaliel fellow, he's the leader of one of the most influential Pharisee groups. In fact, this is the Pharisee group that Paul is a part of. Paul, he's a part of this Pharisee group that Gamaliel is leading. Gamaliel was a very, very, very highly respected scholar in matters of the law. That's why they're listening to him. Even though the Sadducees disagree a lot with what the Pharisees believe and vice versa, when Gamaliel speaks, he's like, this Harvard professor at large, right? He's like that type of guy. So he is a member of the Sanhedrin, and when he speaks, the Sadducees listen to him. So as he shares, he's like, hey guys, pump the brakes. Let's think about this for a second. You guys are thinking we need to kill them. He's like, whoa, 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 whoa. He gives a couple of examples. The first is Thaddeus in verse 36. Some time ago, this is Gamaliel speaking, some time ago, Thaddeus appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed, all his followers were dispersed, and it came to nothing. Now, this first example that he gives in history, it's 100% true, because historians, looking back, they know nothing about this guy. Today, we try to research this dude. The only thing historians know about this guy is this verse right here. And so the example he's giving about Thaddeus is true. We don't know anything about him. According to Gamaliel, he had a pretty sizable following of 400 people willing to follow him, but that's nothing compared to Rome. That's nothing compared to the Roman military. And so eventually, reading between the lines, probably what happened is Rome eventually came in, killed him, probably crucifying him because that's the Roman execution system. Now, the next example he gives is Judas. It's a little bit murky, right? A little bit not so true. And we'll get one thing out of the way. Judas was a very common name in that time. It's obviously not the same person who betrayed Jesus, because that person, hung himself, and so he's no longer with them at that time. And the other thing, this is just a detail, because I see a lot of Christians even, they're naming their son Jude, right? Jude, like Jude Law. Jude is short for Judas. And it happened really shortly after Judas betrayed Jesus, because they don't want to confuse the two. There's a book of the Bible called Jude. The full name is Judas. And so you have these little boys, and they're running around, they're cute, and they're named Judas. That's what their name is. My advice is probably don't want to name your kid Judas. The second example is Judas, verse 37. After him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. He too was killed, and his followers were scattered. Now, Gamaliel says both of these guys amounted to nothing. And it was true in the first situation. This second one, he's kind of fudging a little bit, because Judas is the founder of a group called the Zealots. The Zealots were pretty influential during Jesus' time. They wanted to overthrow Rome by any means necessary. In other words, hey, if it's violence, it's violence. It is what it is. We need to overthrow Rome. This is the Judas who founded the Zealots. Zealots believed that God was the only true ruler over Israel. God was the only one that we should pay tribute to, not to the emperor, not to Rome. And all other tribute payment was betrayal of loyalty and blasphemy to God. It's pledging allegiance to the emperor by paying tribute. That's blasphemous. This is what the Zealots believed, and you know what? Frankly, rightfully so. But the violence part, that's not how God does things. In theory, there's truth in Judas's thought, the zealot's thought. However, it's not how God does things. God brings Jesus Christ, who brings love, forgiveness, reconciliation. He's the Prince of Peace. And in time, God will do what God does through the kingdom that he's inaugurating here on the earth, that he's unfolding his plan, not through violence. Look, Jesus himself, some of the apostles, some of the 12, that's two, some of the 12. Some of the 12, they were zealots. A few of the apostles that Jesus discipled, they were zealots too. So this is an influential party. Judas was a highly influential founder, and Gamaliel, he's basically just throwing shade at him, and it's not quite true. But everyone there is like, okay, kill them, come to nothing. Therefore, in verse 38, therefore, in the present case, I, Gamaliel, advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God. Now, his ultimate take on the apostles in the situation, it's not to murder them, as the others wanted to do. He's just saying, leave them alone. Don't make martyrs out of them as this group is just beginning. This young church movement is gaining momentum. The last thing you want to do is make martyrs out of them, which will galvanize. It'll encourage the followers in the short term even more. Now, Gamaliel, again, he's a scholar. He knows the Old Testament. He believed in the sovereignty and providence of God, which is a very good thing. In that point, he's correct. God is sovereign. He is the creator. He has the right to rule over his creation. God has providence over his creation, meaning he has the will and power to make his will happen. And so Gamaliel believes in sovereignty and providence of God. Very, very good. The issue is he's on the wrong side of it. The issue is he doesn't understand that he is on the wrong side of God's providence. He says, look, if the apostles are doing God's will, then there's nothing you can do anyway to stop it. Even if you kill them, someone else is going to rise up. If it's God's will, it's going to happen. So his assumption is, this is not God's will. That's his assumption. So he says, just let it fizzle out. Just like the other movements and the examples he gave with the zealots and the other guy, I can't remember, the guy we forgot in history. Like, those faded out, let them fade out too. And so here's the decision that the Supreme Court comes to in verse 40. His speech persuaded them. They called the apostles in and had them flogged. Then they ordered them not to speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. The funny thing is, or ironic thing is, God used Gamaliel, an unbeliever, a non-Christian, to protect the apostles, although it was despite him. Like, Gamaliel's actions were not good here. His motives were not good necessarily because he's working against God, but God still used that to protect the early young church and the apostles. Who knows what twists and turns would have happened if the apostles actually were murdered this day. What he says is correct. He just didn't realize he was on the wrong side of history. There's nothing, something doesn't make sense if you think about it, though. Because Gamaliel says, once the leader is killed, the members disperse, and it won't be a concern. And so here's the question. We're talking about Christianity, right? Wasn't their leader killed? Wasn't Jesus killed? And yet the members did not disperse. They are growing in momentum. The movement continues to grow. And Gamaliel, we think, well, he should know this, that they tried killing Jesus, Christianity is still around. We don't understand his perspective because we look at it from a Christian perspective, and we know history looking back. But from the perspective of the unbelieving Jew, this is what they are thinking. The apostles are mistaken. They're in the wrong. The main issue is they don't believe that Jesus is resurrected. They think those are just lies, or those are just rumors. And if you don't believe that Jesus is resurrected, then this Christian movement in their mind has no legs anyway. It's just bound to fail in time, because eventually the lie will come out. Jesus wasn't actually resurrected. It's all a lie. Someone stole the body, blah, blah, blah. That's what they think anyway. And so if Jesus is a dead human, not raised from the dead, then yeah, he's the same as Judas, the zealot Judas, or he's the same as Thaddeus, who we don't even know about in history. And just like their movements eventually fizzled out, the Christian movement will fizzle out too. Pretty wise, he's just mistaken. So instead of death, the court reinforced officially the earlier court order to stop preaching Jesus, right? They re-emphasized it. They said, just like the previous court case against Peter and John, now in this current court case against the rest of the apostles, including Peter and John, stop preaching about Jesus. But then they had them flogged, whipped, punished, which is different and an escalation from what happened in the other court case. And in Acts, this is the first physical oppression that Christianity experiences. This is the first, we see that the resistance is growing little by little against the Christian movement. So they're commanded, don't preach anymore, and then they're whipped and beaten. And in verse 41, we see the apostles' reaction. The apostles left the Sanhedrin, rejoicing, because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. Day after day, in the temple courts and from house to house, they never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Messiah. They are rejoicing. Now, they are obviously not rejoicing because they got whipped. They didn't enjoy the flogging. It's painful. A lot of other passages in just history we know that even though our passage kind of skims over, they were flogged. It doesn't talk about it much. They were flogged. But we know that in other cases when people were flogged, sometimes it's so traumatic that they die from the flogging. So this flogging is not like a slap on the wrist. This is a painful experience, yet the apostles are rejoicing. They rejoice because Jesus predicted this. They're thinking back to the time when Jesus said, hey, people will hate you, people will persecute you because you are my disciple. He said that before he left for heaven. And so they're rejoicing because this is reinforcing Jesus' words that, hey, we are in God's will. The punishment we receive, the flogging here, validates that we are on the right side of history and they are wrong. That's why they're rejoicing. They're not rejoicing because they love to suffer. They're not rejoicing for suffering's sake. They rejoice because they held Jesus in such high regard that if they could identify with him, even if it's through persecution, that this is an honor. I have to just reinforce again. Suffering just for suffering's sake, that's dumb. But they're suffering because they have such a higher purpose. They're suffering because they have such high regard for Jesus. They're suffering because they know they're within God's will, as Jesus predicted this would happen for them. And the other reaction to the beating and the court order to stop preaching the name of Jesus is proclamation. They return right to the very same place that they were arrested because they were preaching Jesus in the temple courts. And they did the very same thing that they told them not to do, that they were arrested for. They were preaching and teaching the resurrected Jesus Christ. They continued to stand their ground in God's house because the leadership have corrupted God's house. In addition, this is an addition that we see here. They're not just teaching and preaching in the temple courts. They're going house to house now. And so even though they receive physical beatdown, even though they receive a second court order, even though the Sanhedrin had murderous intent towards them, they are more faithful to what Jesus told them to do. Okay, so what? And good for them. So what does this mean for us? Well, I think we have to remember always, God's plan cannot be thwarted. And we want to be on the correct side of history. Now, of course, we don't know always at the time we're in it, but as best as we can, we live each day faithfully to the knowledge we have with God. And in time, as we take steps, if we're faithful to God's will, we'll be shown to be on the correct side of history. I've heard people say, well, if God's plan can't be thwarted, then it doesn't matter what I do. God's going to do what he's going to do. If God's plan can't be thwarted, then I can just live a sinful life. If God's plan can't be thwarted, I don't need to be faithful. I don't need to sacrifice anything. I could do whatever I want. God will accomplish his will with or without me. And my question to them is, doesn't sound like you love God. Right? Doesn't sound like you love God to me, if that's your heart. Because if you love somebody, then you love if you love God, you're going to love his good, perfect, and pleasing will. If you love God, just like the apostles here, even willing to receive beatings, knowing that they're in God's will, I'm not saying we should receive beatings. Hear me correctly on this. I'm saying for us, yes, God's plan cannot be thwarted. His will be accomplished. If we love God, we want to participate in that. At the same time, sometimes suffering can be an indication that we're doing the right thing. It can be. I'm not advocating for suffering just for the sake of it. That's pointless. It's meaningless. What I'm saying is, until God's plan is complete and Jesus returns, in the meanwhile, of course we're going to struggle because this world, its patterns are, honestly, do you think our society is becoming more Christian or less Christian? It's becoming less Christian. And so as society becomes less Christian, for those of us who are trying to do God's will, the struggle is going to grow with us. And sometimes struggling means that's validation that we're in God's will. Why is this important? Because we live in a society today where if there's discomfort, something's wrong. If there's suffering, something's wrong. And it could be with Christianity sometimes that if there's suffering in your life, there's something right. If there's suffering, it's because the patterns of this world are working against us. Just like with the apostles, they suffered, and it was validation that they were correct. Please hear me correctly. I'm not saying suffer, just because I make some dumb choices and I suffer because of it. Yeah, I'm in God's will. I'm not saying that. I'm saying sometimes being faithful to God's will cause hardships in our lives. And just because there's hardship does not mean something's wrong. It could be something is very right in our lives.